G'day everyone, Dikko here with another kick-ass walkthrough, and this is part 1 of a brand new multi-part series called The Ultimate Guide to 3D Character Modeling. And we're going to be covering everything, down from the sketch to the sculpting, down to the retopo, and then we're going to do the materials, and then we're going to do the rendering, and it's all going to be animation friendly, which is just what we want if we're going to create any sort of short films. So join me in this part 1 of this grand project in which we're going to talk about how to create the appropriate concepts and the appropriate references for creating the model in 3D. So let's jump right in and get started. But I have one favor to ask from you, and that is to like, that is to subscribe, and that is to support the channel by any which way you can, whether it's through Patreon, whether it's through the affiliate links I have down below. Any support I have, the more support I have, the more videos I get to create, and it goes a long, long way. So let's jump right into it. Okay, so starting off with this basic sketch, I already have an idea of what I want to create. Now, already off the bat, I reckon someone's already saying, why haven't you shown me how to make the bloody hero sketch? And the answer is pretty simple. I have no idea what you are planning on drawing. So for me to go through how I went about drawing this might be completely wrong for your needs. So if you need some information on how to create these, what I recommend is looking up some decent drawing tutorials on doing basic character work. Other than that, it may be entirely possible for you to use AI generators to create a very simple character in a style that you deem fit for creating a 3D model with. The other thing you can do, of course, is if you know someone who can draw, ask them if you can collaborate and offer to create a 3D model from one of their drawings. That would be a really cool way to learn, and it doesn't come with the icky ethics dilemma that is currently associated with AI image generation. But with that being said, I am an artiste, so I'm going to do this manually. Now, the goal here is to create basically a model sheet. And that model sheet will include a T-pose with a front view and a side view. And if you are planning on making video game characters, you may want to consider doing a back view as well. And the choice of tool in this case is using Krita, as you can see. And Krita is an amazing software. Not only does it have a bunch of really nice default brushes, it has some nice default features such as mirroring. And we're going to use that a lot in this case because we are going to be using a symmetrical character design for the most part. Now, before you start your drawing journey, I do recommend 2 things. 1, make the canvas a neutral gray. It will just help with your eye strain. I cannot overstate this. If you tend to draw at night like I do, the last thing you want is to have a white canvas burning a fucking hole into your retinas as you're drawing. The other thing I recommend is a textured brush with a different color other than black. That just helps you prevent yourself from being too precious about your line work and too precious about your block out, because we are going to be doing a refinement pass anyway, and having a colored line just makes it a little bit more fun as well. Now, when learning how to create characters, I do recommend, for the most part, to have a relatively symmetrical character. That will just make it a little bit easier to learn the fundamentals of character design and learn the fundamentals of 3D modeling. Once you get a handle of that, I would then go ahead and attempt to do a more asymmetrical character, whether it's through its physical features or whether it's through its costume design. Now, as you can see here, I've pumped up the speed of the time lapse here just to make it a little bit easier to communicate what's going on. But basically, you start off with a fairly basic block out of the character. You can do it in chunks, you can do it as geometric shapes, you can do it any way you like, as long as you block out the relative proportion of the character in a way that is satisfying to you. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and tell you what the best proportions are for your character, what the best way of drawing this stuff is. The answer is that it's completely subjective. There's a million different ways we can approach this T-pose, but what I do recommend is starting very basic. Now, the nice thing about having a hero pose is that you have a point of reference to begin your drawing from. Now, that's why I have it on the side there visually, so I can see just how I want the body to be proportioned out relative to that hero pose. Now, there are some things that I tend to do when I create these T poses. One of the things, namely, is to draw an underlying body underneath the clothing. I tend to do this because I like to have the ability to model out the body first before adding the clothes on top. Now, this is completely optional, of course. If you have a character that is never going to change their clothes, or it's going to be a very simple, low poly character, then this is completely redundant for you. That being said, if you are planning on creating a character that is going to be utilizing maybe some cloth simulation or going to have some more advanced rigging tools involved, then you may need to have a full body underneath the clothing, particularly when it comes to cloth simulation. I will say, however, having a nice underlying body type to fit the clothes on top of in the sketch will help you create essentially, well, theoretically, more realistic clothings because they will sit on the body in a more realistic way, even in the sketch phase of your concept. Now, as I mentioned, this character is largely going to be a symmetrical character, but that doesn't mean that you can't add a little bit of asymmetry here and there. So, in particular, the hair, for instance, you can have asymmetrical hair, or if you want to have some sort of props to break up that symmetry, you can use handbags, or maybe some sort of tattoos, or maybe some sort of clothing element that isn't too extreme in the asymmetry, that it will become more of a burden to model than if you just kept it simple, for instance. Again, let me emphasize, if you're doing this for the first time or if you are learning how to do this, you don't want to add more stress to the process. Trust me, there are so many instances I've had of students in the past where they've just gone absolute ham on the character design, and then they just don't know where to begin because there's just so many elements to worry about. Keep it simple in this first instance, and then expand your skills, and then add more complexity to your characters going forward. Okay, as we round out the front view of this T pose, we need to start thinking about how we're going to approach the side view, and that's going to be really important. And I'll discuss why that's important before we jump into it. All right, we've got our front view done. Now, what we need to create is the side view. Now, the side view is super important because it helps to give an impression of depth. Having the front view is great. Having the side view is even better because it helps you form that 3D shape in a much more effective way by knowing how deep a character is, how their face is structured, whether their bridge of their nose is bent or smooth or curled or whatever. Those sort of things are inferred through the side pose. You can't really see that in the front pose. So having both is really useful. So let's go ahead and get that done, and then we'll get into refining the line work as well. So jumping into the side view, what I recommend is setting up some guides to sort of line up key proportional elements of your character that you can define in both the front view and the side view in 3D space. This just helps you be able to figure out the depth of your character in both front view and side view when you're modeling or sculpting or whatever, and it keeps you on track. Now, pretty much every drawing app has some form of creating guides. It's usually through the View tab or through some sort of Edit tab. But basically, look through your app, see if there's a guides option, and then you can sort of click and drag guides to fit. As you can see, I've got quite a few, particularly around the eyes, the shoulders, the hips, and the knees. So points of articulation tend to be really good places to put guides, and also key features such as the position of the eyes, the position of the nose, lips, etc. It just helps you keep track of things. What I like to do as well is that when I'm creating the side view of my character, I like to overlay it on top of my front view with a new layer, especially when I'm doing the face. The face is really tricky to make sure you get a nice lined up view in the side view. And even when you bring it into 3D space, you will find that because we're kind of drawing a semi orthographic image, it's never going to look completely perfect unless you're really good with your anatomy. So keep that in mind as well. So, for instance, my eyes, the eyes that I've drawn for this character in the side view, technically they are incorrect, but graphically they look good. So you're gonna be mindful of that, especially when we come into the 3D space. I've chosen to go with a more graphical approach because it just gives me a better indication of what this character should look like, if that makes sense. it's more likely than not that this side view of the eye will look a lot flatter than what it looks like in the 2D image. And you'll see that when we get to that stage as well. Other things to be mindful of are the feet position. So when you're creating a character in the front view, you tend to add a little bit of perspective, specifically on the contact points of the feet. Now, what you'll notice is that you tend to draw the legs a little bit shorter because that's where the ankle, or sorry, that's where the heel is hitting the floor. So you can see I've lined up the heel of my side view shoe to match the heel of my front view pose. Now, what that results in is a deceptively shorter character. And that's mainly because my side view is looking a little bit more orthographic, a little bit flatter in perspective than my front view. And that's a choice on my behalf to be aware of. And having a fully orthographic, flat looking design on the front view is always going to look a little bit weird if you go down that route, even if technically it's more accurate. So that's a choice you can make. So obviously, as I mentioned before, one of the most important aspects of a side view is nailing the side profile of a character because it really does define the depth of that character overall. Now, that can be quite tricky to get right depending on the kind of character you're designing. So, if you're going with something with a bit more of a conventional sort of Pixar-esque Disney or DreamWorks proportion set, you will need to take into account certain aspects of that character design, such as the depth of the eyes, or the slope of the bridge of the nose, or the way that the mouth sort of sits out front of the skull, or maybe the way that the skull is curving or the way that the forehead is shaped. Those all really make a big difference when it comes to appeal of a certain character's face. In my case, I want to have a little bit of sharpness in the face. I want to have a sharper nose or a little bit more of a more angular feel to the character. So that's quite tricky to make it look good, and I found. So you see that I tend to play around with the face a lot more than the rest of the body. And that's for good reason, obviously, because it's the first thing that everyone's going to be looking at when they look at this character. And of course, making sure that you do have a sort of blocking out phase or a sketching phase will help you nail down those features earlier rather than you worrying about it by jumping straight into a more refined pass. The other thing to be mindful of is just the balance of posture. So, what you want to have ideally is a default pose that indicates balance in the character. You don't want to have a character leaning too far forward or too far back, or being top heavy or front heavy or back heavy, because those sort of things will be reflected in 3D space 10 times over. It becomes way more noticeable when a character just feels off balance in 3D than it does in 2D. So, with that being said, I would actually recommend creating a guideline down the center line of your character in the side view as well. And you can sort of judge the balance of the front of the body versus the back of the body and how it sort of sits in that in between line. I do tend to do that a lot when it comes to my characters. Another thing you can do as well is try to integrate a little bit of that character's personality through its posture. So if a character is going to be a bit more aggressive, they would have a more aggressive default posture. If they're going to be a bit more dainty, they would have a more dainty posture. If they're going to be a bit more cutesy, etc., you get the idea. So you want to play with that as well. And you tend to see that more in the side view than you do in the front view. Now, as I continue to play around with the facial features of this character on the side view, I do want to talk about particular instances where you may need to create a back view as well. And that is particularly relevant for those who are interested in creating video game characters, specifically video game characters that are going to be seen in third person. So if your character is 90% of the time going to be facing away from the camera, away from the viewer who is playing the game, you may want to put some emphasis on designing an interesting back, if that makes sense. That's a really important thing to be aware of in order to create a very dynamic, strong silhouette in a character that is, for the most part, going to be facing away from the player. Okay, so with these two sketches done, let's go ahead and start some refinements. Now, what I'm going to say here is that the next few stages are, relatively speaking, kind of optional. That being said, it is definitely beneficial to have a more refined image to use as reference in 3D. So what we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and color in my hero pose, we're going to go ahead and create some more refined line work for the characters. And we're also going to refine some of the proportions based on that initial sketches. So let's jump in. Let's get these refined, get them cleaned up, and get them ready for 3D modeling. Okay, so jumping off the bat, what I would like to do to begin this process is actually start to refine the hero character first and then jump into the T-pose. Because what I want to do is at least establish a color palette for this character without having to color in everything. So the hero pose is actually really good for that. That also means that when I do go ahead and bring in the reference images into 3D, the line art will be a lot clearer to see in black and white on the front and side views, leaving me open to just concentrate on getting the model down first, and then I can worry about the colors later on. It's also just a huge fucking time saver. Now, of course, as I mentioned at the start of this video, I've already created this sketch. That being said, if you have a hero pose that you want to color in, go ahead and do that now. I think that's the best time to do it. If you just use an AI generator to do the whole image, then you don't need to do this at all. So you don't have to worry about it. If you got a mate to do the image for you, again, don't worry about this process. You've already got it. Specifically, if they've managed to find some time to color it in, which is kudos to them. Good job. But if you have created a basic sketch as I have here, it's probably a good time to start refining a few things. Now, why do we go ahead and refine the line art? Mainly so it's easier to line up the images in 3D. The other thing as well is that it removes the burden of exploration when it comes to doing all the colors and the shading and the skin tones in 3D. Having a decent base to work from a 2D image is just going to make it a lot easier to get to that point faster when it gets to that stage of creating the textures for characters. Having that reference on hand is just so much easier than having to dick around in 3D for hours and hours and hours, because with 3D, your options are literally unlimited. And because your options are unlimited, you tend to take unlimited amount of time to find the right look, which is honestly a pain in the fucking ass. So yeah, establish the look early, be happy with it, and commit. I also refine the line work just a little bit because one, it looks a lot nicer, and two, it just helps me be more committed to the look. So what I mean by that is that when you're drawing with a sketch, you tend to draw thicker lines and, things are a bit messier. So it gives you a slightly more freedom when it comes to modeling out the proportions and stuff. And that can be a bad thing sometimes. So just sort of refining things a little bit more will help you sort of line up those verts, line up those faces, and line up the sculpt a little bit more consistently. What I do also recommend for those who are creating characters for the first time is to limit your color palette. So limit your color palette to around 3 colors. So in this case, I'm choosing a faint yellow or a pale yellow, pink and gray or black. That's basically my color palette for this character, minus the skin tone, of course, which is brown. But that being said, her undertones, the undertones of her skin, still have that pinkish hue going on in there as well. That just helps keep the balance there too. Okay, so brief little breakdown of how I'm approaching the coloring. Very simple. It's all pretty much on 1 or 2 layers. I have a blocking layer for the colors, and then I have some very basic tonality changes as well, shadows and stuff like that. I'm not going to overdo it with this character because one, it doesn't really need it. It's still a relatively simplistic character design. I don't want to add stuff like textured frocks and textured wool or anything like that. We get the idea with the way that the actual clothing is designed. And on top of that, I don't really plan on modeling in or sculpting in directly anything like that as well. So it's going to be just a fleecy jumper with, softness to it. So I don't really want to bother about the weave, for instance, or getting the texture of the weave into the image. The nature of the design just doesn't warrant that for now. So for this particular character, I'm just happy about the color. I'm happy about the balance of that color and the tonality. And I also believe that the detail in the image is achievable to create in 3D relatively easily. Okay, so now that we have a more refined, colored in version of my hero pose, I'm going to go ahead and apply that to my T-pose character. Now, that being said, I'm not going to go ahead and color this in. I don't need to because I've already got the hero pose. Why bother doing it 2 more times, coloring it in 2 more times? It's pointless in many regards. especially if you're just doing it for yourself and going ahead and just practicing. So there's not really that much point in creating all that extra work for yourself. So just refine the line work at this point. And it's going to be really useful as well. It helps create the right kind of contrast in 3D, so it's easy to trace, that sort of stuff. So let's go ahead and get the line work done. And then we're pretty much finished with the referenced images. Okay, so here on in, it's pretty straightforward. It's just a trace for the most part. So using a similar black brush to what I used on the hero pose, I've just gone ahead and start to trace things out. Just refining the line work, trying to maintain the appeal of the sketch. That's one of the hardest things to do with this is just making sure that you don't remove elements that gave it charm to begin with, or adding too much detail, or just slightly changing something that just feels off. That happens so often when we start to refine stuff. I fucking hate it. It happens every single time. And you can't help it sometimes as well because that energy kind of gets lost in the image. So if you don't like the fact that the image or the reference image that you're creating, the refined image, just is lacking something from that original sketch, you could technically go ahead and just model to that original sketch as well. This is just for clarity, basically. So clarity in 3D space. Because that's what you kind of want when it comes to creating a reference image. You want clarity of information. That's why we're not going to go ahead and color this in either. We're just going to keep it flat. That just allows us to see the contrasting lines a little bit more clearly in 3D space. It allows us to keep track of things a little bit easier as well without conflicting levels of opacity getting in the way of things and all that sort of crap. Um, Again, you start to also see minor issues in proportion sometimes when it comes to drawing out the line work after you've done your sketch. So, for instance, I find that the shoulders are a bit of a pain point in my sketch here. And I'm hoping to either refine that in another pass of this sketch that I haven't shown in this video, or I might just refine it straight in 3D. I haven't decided yet. And it is worth mentioning that there's always opportunity to make improvements along the way, even at this stage of the refinement process in the line art. The only part that I'm going to actually shade in this point is going to be the hair and any contrasting elements, such as the top or the dress or the stockings that the character's wearing. I wouldn't go as far as to make it fully shaded either. Now we're going to go ahead and replicate this same line art in the side view. And as you can see, there's always room for changes, for improvements, for analysis of your artwork and stuff like that. In this case, I'm still going ahead and just modifying the face to sort of fit what I deem as appropriate for the character. Now, this is something that can happen at any stage again. As long as you're happy with the end result, that's really what matters. And whatever you import into 3D, that is what matters because that is what you are going to be using as your direct reference. So you want to make sure you get it right. And of course, while you are doing these changes, you still have to be mindful of making sure that things are lined up in the front and the side view. This is really important. Otherwise, it becomes a lot more difficult to get a decent 3D model blocking since in essence you're going to be fighting between the front view and the side view as to what is the best looking approach and you're going to have to deal with sort of a in between compromise. But of course that is worth saying that you aren't really going to get an absolute perfect match every single time when you do these T poses unless you're like a god at drawing, and I am by no means an absolute expert at sketching and creating characters. All I have is the experiences that I've acquired so far, the skills that I've acquired so far, and that can always be improved, always be refined. And essentially, I would like to get better at this sort of stuff as well. So don't feel bad if your first, second, or third attempt isn't as good as what you'd hoped. All right, so coming back to the image after a day or so, I decided to go ahead and refine a few elements of the character, particularly around a few proportional things, such as the intersection between the arms and the neck. I felt like the neck was a bit too long, the shoulders are a bit too high, and so I just raised up the arms, for instance, to fix that up. Same thing with the interior anatomy of the character. I wanted to give it a bit more of a naturalistic shape, and I made the head a little bit smaller because I felt like it was a bit too big in proportion to the rest of the body. So I've shrunk it down a little bit, and I'm going to also reflect that in this side pose as well. Apart from that, also a few things around the face that I wanted to sort of see what looked a bit more appealing. So I adjusted the bridge of the nose, for instance. So go ahead and fix that up a little bit. Whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, in my opinion, I'm not sure. It does give it a bit more of a conventional face design, but it does look a little bit better balanced. Apart from that, we have a few little tweaks around the body and the torso. I gave it a little bit more thickness to sort of match the original hero sketch as well. So I didn't want to go too far with the hourglass shape in this case. I wanted to give it a little bit more thickness. And it feels a little bit more realistic, a little bit more, I don't know, less pin-uppy, I guess you can say, because it's not a pin-up character. So it helps in that regard. Of course, whatever you want to design for your own character, up to you. And with that being said, everything else is pretty much done. I'm quite happy with this layout. I'm quite happy with this design. And now we can move on to the 3D modeling. Okay, so we've got the line work done. It's all finished. Let's go ahead and have a look at the final result. And yeah, pretty straightforward. It's ready to roll. Everything's lined up, nice and clean. Proportions are the way that I like it for this particular character. And now we are ready to jump into any 3D software we want to create our blocking. Now we're going to go ahead and use Blender for this, and we're going to do that in the next video. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that it was informative. And of course, I hope you guys stick around for the next lot because it's going to be really fun. And I hope you get something out of those as well. So make sure you subscribe. Make sure you keep up to date with anything that comes out. And yeah, have fun with the process. I'll catch you guys later. Have fun. See yous.